our horizons and brought clarity and continuity. And now with a mobile phone, I don't know what in the world we'd do without them. It's just a new way of life. It's a better way of life. It's raising people's standard of living. It's giving them a better lifestyle and doing it very efficiently by doing it in large numbers. When we have a challenge, some new investment or engineering technique, such as we have now, I have a concept that we should do something. And it's interesting that this week I went down and joined our people and got involved in all the details with a group of suppliers and others. And being with them, I realized that the plan that I had was impractical from the standpoint when you get involved in all of these details. You realize that perhaps you shouldn't do it. You should condense it or put it off. But you know, afterwards, when you back away from the detail and you think it through, you realize that for your long-term objectives, you really should do it. And that's a decision you have to make when you're exercising or walking or when you're alone. There's a time where you've got to make those decisions, where you have to go with something that you really feel strongly about. Now, obviously, if you're bored and so on, turns you down, as I spoke, so on and so on. But they tend to, on an engineering or technical innovation or something like that, they have tended to go with me. I mean, we can afford to lose sometimes, and that's very important. If you're afraid to lose, you can't win. I thought that television would move to be something more like the magazine racks. You know, in those days, in the mid-'60s, the magazine racks that featured just a few magazines started to have dozens of magazines, specialty magazines, so that if you were into boating or skiing or medicine or whatever your interest was, there would be many different magazines available for you. So the magazine rack went from just a few to a multitude. And I thought television would do the same thing. But of course, we don't have the over-the-air frequencies for that. So the only thing that could work would be cable television. And I was fortunate enough to get involved in cable, again, thinking that is what the trendsetters would be moving towards, and that would be the future in 1966, 1967. And there was really, we were the first Canadian company to be involved. Gulf and Western and CBS, strangely enough, were involved in a very small way in Toronto, but no one else was. Ed Jarmain in London had pioneered cable, and it had been pioneered out west as well in Vancouver back in 1952 in Canada. So I certainly didn't pioneer the early days in cable. Sid Welsh did in Vancouver. And those people really deserve the credit for pioneering it, but it had never grown in the big cities. And that's when I got involved. We haven't in this discussion talked about what you give up, because life isn't a one-way street. But some of the things you give up is you give up family a bit. You don't do the things. You don't go fishing with your children as you maybe should have done. You don't spend the time with your wife. And how many people who have been very active in business, their wives consider the business perhaps a competitor? Or how many marriages have been broken up because of that? Now, fortunately, my wife's father was in politics for 33 years as a member of the Parliament in Great Britain, undefeated. And so she's used to public service, and we think of our business as public service, because that's what it is. And he later became governor of Bermuda, and she was used to being involved in public. So when we started to get calls from subscribers to our home, she and the children were brought up to take the calls. And remember that they are the servants of the cable subscribers. And without the cable subscribers, they wouldn't have the clothes on their back. They wouldn't go to the schools they go to. And when you're brought up with that feeling, just as she was brought up with her father, that when constituents called, you are the servant of the constituents, or you won't get reelected. And so that's very, very important. You give up privacy if you're in this kind of business. Now, in our case, our phone is listed. I believe in that. Many people in business want to have a phone that's not listed and so on, but you can't do that in broadcasting and cable and cellular. We're involved with the public. We have hundreds of thousands of customers, any one of which is free to call me anytime, day or night, at home or in business. They used to call more than they do now. And we go on television, all our key people, once a month, two-way. In other words, people phone in and make suggestions and make complaints. So if we have messed up in cable, we have 1,800,000 homes that can embarrass us in front of all the other customers. So we really try to give a good service, but we're accountable. When one talks about contemplating total ruin, financially going under, of course, we're sitting right here where back in the 60s it was necessary to put a third mortgage on, and the house was in my wife's name, and the people who came up, the only person you could get to do it weren't pleasant people, and put her down to a great extent. It was a very awkward and terrible time. And we've had other times that have been where you had to contemplate, going under. There haven't been many, but I think if you're afraid of that, you shouldn't be in business. I've always been, in my feeling, an outsider or a rebel. I think that's because my mother was ill when I was growing up. I was in boarding school a lot. I wasn't part of any establishment. My parents didn't go off to the... And I've always felt I was sickly as a child, so you begin to picture yourself as not as good as other people. And I really have always felt that way. Certainly I wasn't a good student. I never went to business school. So I have always been having that feeling that I wasn't as good as other people, except I'm an enthusiast and a driver. And I was very keen in politics on John George Diefenbaker, and he was, of course, the classic outsider. And those of us who were for him, we felt we were outsiders. I was once expelled from the party. I was president of the Toronto Young Conservatives, and I was voted out of office because I spent the Treasury on a lunch supporting John Diefenbaker, unfortunately ahead of my time in 1953, and he became leader in 1957. But all of those things, we triumphed in the end. The outsiders became the insiders, and I think that's what history is all about. Now, in the case of my father, there were many stories and many memories. He was a man who worked very hard. He'd work in his father, my grandfather Rogers, was a great businessman. He was involved in the founding of Imperial Oil, and he was a director of many companies, and he was immensely successful in business. And I think he passed on some of those qualities to my father, because most inventors don't have a clue about money and and how to run a business. Lee DeForest, if you saw the program recently, died with $600 in his bank account. Major Armstrong, who invented FM, plunged from the top of the RCA building. The success of innovative, bright inventors in business is not good. So my father was a balance, and he would work in the business during the day. He would work in the lab often at night, and then he would sleep for a few hours and go back in. And then the next night he might drive to New York, because the other side of his personality was that he enjoyed a good time. He was an active man, and he partied hard and he worked hard. And I think for all those reasons is why he died at 38. Probably, and I've always felt, living more than 76 years in those 38 years. But I wish I'd known him. When you sort of have a low point in your life and you're thinking about, geez, am I going to be doing the right thing or have I done the right thing? Obviously, the time for that is when you're ill. And I did have one heart attack, not a serious one. And then more serious, I had an aneurysm. And you go in the hospital and you're out, and I resigned as CEO for 6 weeks. And it's at a point like that you do wonder. And I think that is typical of many of the people perhaps watching this broadcast. That they've had illness and they question their priorities and that sort of stuff. In my case, I think because of the emotional drive for what I've been trying to do, that it's easier for me to continue it and finish it than it would be for most people who were just looking at it from a purely financial advantage. But even with that emotional drive, I have asked myself, well, haven't you done enough? And why don't we slow down? The trouble with that is that it's such a fast-moving, exciting, technologically oriented, capital-intensive business. And I've got a family of people in our company raring to go and in the war terms, leading the attack on the different fronts. And it's very hard to walk away from that. I don't want to let down the flag. It's hard for a boxer to stop boxing. And it's just you get in the chase, in the race, and you can't take your running shoes off. So I putting that emotional answer aside, I certainly have planned, it's in the interests of the company, that there be a transition, and I have decided that I would think the time for that would be when I'm about 67. That's the end of the decade. I think before that, probably in 96, that there should be a chief operating officer for the whole group brought in, and that immediately limits me, but it's important to do that, and that it be that smooth transition. Now, I hope it works like that. My great fear since I was a small boy is dying young, as my father did, and I hope I have good health as well as and living to that point. If not, then there's lots of good people who can take over, as I stress the value of the team with Phil Lind and Colin and Jim and Graham and so on. But I would hope for that. Now, if that works, none of our children would be ready at that point, so it would be under professional management for a dozen years or whatever. And hopefully at that point that one of the 4 children would be interested in getting in the driver's seat and getting the running shoes on.
There are great myths perpetrated about what it takes for nations and societies to prosper. We hear that low taxes is a key, or low interest rates, or government intervention, or lack of government intervention. But few talk about the personal truths, the truth Ted Rogers illustrates. Ted Rogers was there at the beginning of FM radio, and there again at the beginning of cable TV, and there again with cellular telephones, and now with the challenge to the phone company's monopoly. He didn't invent any of these new developments, but he was among the first to recognize their potential and to invest upon that knowledge. That is the source of the earned wealth of peoples and nations, men and women with the ability to look ahead and to act. Why aren't there more of them? Because as Ted Rogers says, and as his life illustrates, it takes courage to bet the farm, the courage to make a mistake, big ones, conceivably even fatal ones, in order to stay at the edge where the rewards really are. It is Ted Rogers' courage that has made him an original.